Up next, I am very excited to introduce you to Bjarke Berg. Bjarke works at Umbraco HQ and is the project lead on the migration of Umbraco CMS to .NET Core 5. He started working at Umbraco HQ in 2018, but has worked with Microsoft technologies for more than 10 years and started professionally using .NET Core back in 2015 when it was in release candidate. He'll be walking us through the newest upcoming release of the much anticipated Umbraco 9. And with that, please help me in welcoming him to the virtual stage. Welcome, Bjarke.
Thank you. Yes, we're going to talk about Umbraco 9, which will be the upcoming major version of Umbraco. So I will call it .NET Core, even that it is officially renamed to .NET 5. But to make it clear, when I talk about the old .NET framework and the new framework, I will still call it .NET Core. First, some motivation for why to move to .NET Core. First of all, .NET framework is end of life, so there won't come any new versions. Also, .NET Core is cross-platform, and we know a lot of developers are using Mac. So in the future, they can use Mac to host Umbraco instead of a virtual machine hosting Windows and then Umbraco. And of course, for hosting purposes, it will open up for using Docker and other alternatives to Windows. .NET Core has some significant performance improvements, and especially in the web framework. And I also think it is important to avoid legacy technologies. So if you have a newly educated developer, they wouldn't have touched .NET framework anymore because .NET Core have been there for 5 years. Some of the goals for the project is to make migration as easy as possible. We do this by keeping the client code untouched, at least as much as possible. But we still want to adopt the best practices from .NET Core. By the end of the project, it is important that all backend technologies is up to date. This is also the reason we are now aiming for releasing on .NET 5. When the project started, it was .NET 3.1, .NET Core 3.1, which was the latest at that point in time. And finally, it's also super important for HQ that we have community involvement. Regarding community involvement, we have introduced a new team, a new community team called the Unicore team. It consists of Simone, Emma, Benjamin, and Steve from the community, and me from HQ. We help other community members by answering forum or Twitter and so on. We help migrating the code base, and I have used the team a lot as a sounding board, so if I need to discuss some of our decisions. First, let's take a look at the new web framework, which is still called ASP.NET Core, even that the full framework is now renamed to just .NET. The first thing you'll notice is the change in the project structure. So on the image on the left side, I have a screen dump from an ASP.NET MVC website, which is running framework. And the screen dump on the right side, we have an ASP.NET Core website, MVC website. So the first change is that the project file itself has changed. Now it is required to use the new SDK format, which is also available to framework, but not the default one. Some of the benefits of this new format is that the NuGet packages are listed inside that solution or project file, and we don't have to list all the files in the structure. This makes it easier when you merge on active projects. Next, you will realize there are less folders. This is because the new folder www-root, which contains all the files that should be accessible from a browser, as opposed to the old app data, which worked in the different way. So by default, everything were accessible from a browser unless it was located in app data. Next, you will realize we don't have a web config. Instead, our configuration is located in the app settings files. and you will realize we don't have a global ASAX file anymore. Instead, the program CS file is the entry point to your application. Inside that folder or file, we have a static main method like we know from console programs and other programming languages. All right, next, we're going to talk about the web server, because when we have to be cross-platform, we can't be tightly coupled, or the framework can't be tightly coupled to IIS anymore. Instead, there's a built-in web server called Kestrel. It is not recommended to use Kestrel directly on public-facing websites like most Umbraco websites. Instead, it is recommended to have a reverse proxy in front, like IIS, NGINX, Apache, or whatever, reverse proxy in front. But on Windows, Microsoft has made it possible to run Kestrel in process of IIS to minimize the overhead of the reverse proxying. Then we have to talk about the HTTP context, because it has been completely rewritten in the new web framework. Now we have a lightweight HTTP context with a much smaller memory footprint on each request. This is one of the reasons to the better performance. And a cool benefit is it is implemented with testability in mind. So now we can actually test code that uses the HTTP context using unit tests. Next, we have now an aligned web stack. In Framework, we were used to having two concepts, one for MVC websites and one for web APIs. Even that these concepts were almost the same, there were two concepts. Now they're merged into a single concept. This is very valuable for an application like Umbraco because we use both concepts. So now we don't have to duplicate most filters and most controllers anymore. Then we have a new request pipeline, which is heavily inspired from the OWIN project. Now we are using middlewares, as it's called. We can look at this image where we have a request. It executes some code in the first middleware, and that middleware can determine whether or not to call the next middleware and so on. So if that middleware can handle that request, say it is a static file middleware, it found a file for that request, then it can just return. But otherwise, we can call the next middleware and so on. And when we not are calling the next middleware, it will traverse back. So the first middleware is most likely some kind of error handling. So we can catch all errors that happens in the following middlewares. Another very cool thing in the new web framework is dependency injection is now a first-class citizen. So it ships with a simple dependency injection container. It can be replaced by several other dependency injection containers because they use the same common abstractions. The cool thing is all framework services are available in this container. And because dependency injection is a first-class citizen, it is possible to inject dependencies almost everywhere, even in views and filters and areas that was not possible to use dependency injection in the old web framework. Of course, we also have new features. As I said, now we can inject into views using the new Razor keyword add inject. We also have a new feature called tag helpers, which can be used as an alternative to HTML helper. You can now create your own HTML tags or attributes, and these will be executed on the server and can manipulate the content before it is shipped to the client. As I said, it is an alternative to HTTP helper. So for form inputs, Microsoft ships with all kinds of alternatives. We also have a new concept called view components, which is basically the same as controllers, but without all the routing. So these can be used for reusable components inside your views and thereby replacing the child-only actions. And finally, we can use the latest features from the language itself, C#9, like records. So let's take a look at what has changed in Umbraco and how to migrate an Umbraco 8 project. We have removed the last remains from web forms. So the page called nonodes.aspx is now migrated to MVC. This page is the one you see the first time you use Umbraco without any content. Also, we have cleaned macros for the last remains of web forms. This also means we can remove the view engine that can handle web forms and speed up things a little. Then NuGet packages have changed due to the new SDK format of project files. We can't just copy content into the solution. This is not part of the new NuGet protocol. Also, we can't execute a PowerShell script when you install the NuGet package. Instead, we are using target files, which contains MS build targets. So we can execute some code before build and before clean. Using these techniques, we can copy our content into the solution before you build, and we can remove it before you clean. So we ensure you are on the latest code from the version you have downloaded. A side effect of the new SDK format, because the dependencies to NuGet packages are inside that project file, we can also use that to generate NuGet packages. This leads to one assembly per package, and this is best practices in .NET Core, and we of course follow that. We also introduced a meta package in top, which is basically just a package without any code, but only dependencies to other packages to make it easy to get started. The namespace system web is almost gone. So some of the parts have been replaced and re-implemented in system.net. And now these implementations are .NET Standard compatible, so cross-platform. And the rest of the namespace is more or less now implemented as part of the new web framework, ASP.NET Core. We had a lot of static classes that used third-party dependencies. This is not really possible if you want to use dependency injection like we do. So we had to change these static classes to instance classes and interfaces. So now you need to inject hosting environment instead of using the static hosting environment. And instead of using the static IO helper, you need to inject IO helper, and so on for Umbraco version, type finder. There will be more cases. Also for Umbraco context, which is different for each request. So here you need to inject an Umbraco context accessor to get it. This is the reason, or the reason for this is to allow you to inject it into simpletons. And we follow the same pattern that Microsoft uses for HTTP context. We also had some dependencies that were not compatible with the new framework. The first one was client dependency. We have replaced this with Smidge. Both are used to minimize and bundle JavaScript and CSS files. Both projects are created and managed by Shannon Diminick from Umbraco HQ. Also, image processor was not available for the new technology. Instead, we have replaced with Image Sharp. Both is created and managed by James Jackson South. Then we also have Lucene.NET version 2, which we are going to need to update to version 4. Because the new version is cross-platform support. This is a nested dependency, so Umbraco doesn't have the dependency itself, but we are using Examine that are using Lucene.NET 2, so we need to update Examine. So due to the new format and the new protocol of NuGet, we can't just install like we used to do. We used to just create an empty website following or using the Microsoft projects, and then install the NuGet package from Umbraco. Instead, we have adopted the new pattern called .NET New Templates. This is a new pattern to create templates, and these templates can be installed using NuGet, and you can install templates using the command line, Visual Studio, or even Writer. As you can see in the screenshot, Visual Studio have picked up my two packages. You can also see from the command line, it's pretty easy. Just .NET New Umbraco and give it a name. Then you are in the same state as if you had created an Umbraco or an Microsoft empty web template and installed the NuGet packages. We also have another package for getting started with packages. All namespaces has been changed, basically. So due to internal refactoring, we need to reflect the internal structures, but we also decided to prefix all namespaces with umbraco.cms and then the internal structure, and all public extension methods are moved to Umbraco extensions. And then we have added this namespace as part of all views if you use the template, so you don't have to care about using statements. And then it's pretty easy for you to see what extension methods are available. Due to dependency injection, we also have updated most constructors. And if you're using dependency injection yourself, this should be handled by the container. So in most cases, you won't notice at all. We have adopted to a lot of best practices. So instead of having our own abstractions, we are using Microsoft's common abstractions for logging and also for dependency injection. And finally, for configuration and a new pattern called options pattern. I will dive into that later. Another thing you will notice is that all the static events are gone. We have replaced it with a pattern we call notifications. This is heavily inspired by mediator notifications. Now it makes dependency injection possible. We support async notifications, and we are not tightly coupled to specific implementations like the event was. For authentication, we also had to update users from ASP.NET Identity. So now it's updated to ASP.NET Core Identity. But for members, we had to update from an even older technology called membership providers, and this is now implemented in ASP.NET Core Identity also. Let's take a deeper dive into the configuration and options pattern, because configuration is one of the areas that is changed the most, and you will need to think in a new way. So we were used to read from one single file, basically. That file was transformed to that specific environment. This is not the case anymore. Instead, we are now reading from multiple read-only sources. And some sources with a higher priority will override existing values. These sources and priorities can be configured outside of Umbraco, and Umbraco don't specify any priority. So the default sources and priorities, if you're using our template or if you're using Microsoft's default web templates, is first we read values from appsettings.json. Then we read values from appsettings.environment.json, where the environment is replaced by production by default, but development in your development environment. In development environment, we then read from user secrets, which is the recommended way to store sensitive data like passwords. And then we read from environment variables. This is the recommended way to store sensitive data on production environments. And finally, we read from command line. But it is possible to configure this in a lot of ways. And you can use these providers. There are providers for JSON files, XML files, init files. There's providers for Azure Key Vault, Azure App Configuration, command line, keep a file, memory, or you can even implement your own providers pretty easy. I don't have a good use case, but maybe you have your configuration in a centralized web service or something like that. Let's take a look. So here I have in the upper left corner, I have an example. This could be from app settings. So I have an object called my section. And I have inside that object, I have two values, one called my bool value, which is true, and another value called my string value, which has the value hello world. Then I have specified an environment variable called my section __ my string value with the value override from environment variable. Note the _ is the way to simulate an object in the environment variables. On the right side, I have a class which has two properties, my bool value and my string value. It injects I configuration, and then it reads the configuration from the keys, my section, colon, my bool value, and my section, colon, my string value. Note that the colon is used to simulate the object inside the code. But if I execute this code in my default template, I have the values, my bool value as true and my string value as override from environment variable. There are some downsides to using configuration directly. First of all, it leads to duplicate code, and the naming is pretty fragile because it's basically magic strings. So we also have a new pattern called options pattern. This is used to basically use plain old C# objects known as pogos. You can use these to have a strongly typed access to your configuration keys. You wrap these inside 3 different kind of wrappers, and this lets you inject only the configuration that is relevant for your class, so you can use the single responsibility principle. You can wrap it in I options, which is cached and a singleton. So basically, the first time you read it, it will be that value for the entire application lifetime. You can use I option snapshot. This is cached, but only for the scope. So on next request, if you have changed the configuration files, it will read the new value. And you can use I options monitor, which don't have a cache, and it's a singleton. So here you can update every time, all the time, and you can inject it into singleton classes. The cool thing is you can configure these options in code. You can configure them using the I configuration we saw before. And these options can be validated using validation attribute or even complex validation too. Notice that the ordering is super important. It is also possible to use a post configuration if you have something that needs to be executed as the last thing. So here's a simple example where I basically update my pogo called models builder settings, and I update the value models directory to use the value of the mode. So this is more complex. I can do more complex things using this technique than I can if I'm just using configuration files. But the real power comes when I combine the I configuration with the options pattern. So here I first read the values from the I configuration and then update using the options pattern. So in this case, the values would be my bool value true, and my string value would be my bool value was true. And of course, here you can see why the ordering is important, because if I reversed these two, the value would have been the one from the configuration. I highly recommend to look more into this pattern. You can use PureSite. There's a good talk called Using Configuration and Options in .NET Core and ASP.NET Core apps by Steve Gordon. But also the Microsoft's official documentation is pretty good in this area. Even that we have changed a lot, it will still be the Umbraco you know. So as mentioned in the keynote, the database is almost not changed. The changes to the database is of the size as we know between minor versions of Umbraco 8. Also, the client code is almost untouched. I guess it's around 99% the same as V8. So there's a few exceptions. Members had to be changed a little bit due to the update to ASP.NET Core identity. Enums are aligned, so these are always serialized from our APIs as strings, instead of sometimes as strings and sometimes as integers. And finally, we have had to make some updates to health checks because the new configuration is read-only, so we can't update the configuration for you. Instead, we can point to some documentation that makes you or describe what you need to do yourself. And this is actually also a better solution because then you have the changes as part of your source control. Then we have iPublished content and all the extension methods. iPublished content is the interface that is injected into all views. So all models from Models Builder implements this interface. All the extension methods are those you use to get values like get value and children, descendants, ancestors, and all these. All of them exist, even the ones that use services under the hood. So this is the one case we are not using dependency injection. Instead, we have an internal service locator, which is an anti-pattern, but we have it just to make it easy for you to migrate. We also have overloads that allows you to inject the services yourself. I would recommend using these overloads instead, just because it makes it clear when these extension methods can be expensive to call, instead of the extension methods that don't show this. And also your code will be more testable. Also, the embedded models builder are still available. So the same modes as in Umbraco 8, even that app data is not a concept in ASP.NET Core. We kept that name just to make it easy. Composers and components are still available. Composers now has injected a iUmbraco builder on that class. You have a iService collection, which is the dependency injection abstraction that Microsoft uses. We have added extension methods, so it's easy for you to add new notifications, but all the Microsoft extensions are also available. And in .NET Core, it is best practice to add a single extension method that just adds your solution or your package. So this is also the way we do it. And if you pull down a NuGet package, it would most likely be add the package name, and then you have set up all you need in the container from that package. Also, app plugin folder is almost untouched. We have registered the folder as a second www root folder, so everything inside that folder is accessible from the browser. And the package manifest file is untouched. You can keep it as it was. In theory, packages from Umbraco 8 that didn't add any backend code, so without a DLL, client code or pure client code update packages can be used directly in Umbraco 9. And other concepts are still the same as you know them: surface controllers, render controllers, route hijacking. Remember, this is a technology update mainly, and not conceptual updates like the changes between 7 and 8 was. So let's take a look at some interesting areas if you want to contribute to the project coding-wise. First, let's take a look at our new internal architecture. We have adopted an architecture called Clean Architecture. So in the bottom layer, we have umbracocms.core, which is all our business logic and abstractions. So if we need a third-party dependency, it will be an abstraction, and then the class will be implemented in infrastructure, like repositories that need a dependency to NPOGO, our object relationship mapper. We also have 3 examples of replaceable components or optional components, like examine Lucene and persistence.SQL CE, and the Nucash one. So basically, you just have to implement a second version of this one to replace this technology. It could make sense for examine if you are using Elasticsearch or something instead of the Lucene. Then we have umbracocms.web.common. This is all the common parts for websites, which is shared between website rendering and the back office. And we have the client code in a separate package called static asset, and on the top we have the meta package I talked about. So this package is basically empty but points on other packages. Remember, we are using dependency injection everywhere, and as a general rule, we are having our services as singleton. This means you will need to inject accessors if you are going to use a scoped thing like the Umbraco context or the HTTP context. We also updated our build server pipeline. We're still using Asia pipeline, but now we are using the YAML format. This means we have version control, and we can have different pipelines for different branches. We have separated it into multiple stages. One stage that runs on 3 different machines, is the unit test. So these are executed on Windows, Ubuntu, and Mac OS X. Integration tests and acceptance tests are executed on Windows and Ubuntu. We build artifacts, the NuGet packages and zip files and so on. And for release builds, we also built the static code docs. So how to contribute? Basically, if you are managing a package, I would recommend updating that package. That would be a huge benefit for us because the more packages ready for release, the better. But also test our pre-releases because it's now we can easily change things. As soon as we have the final release, we have to wait 6 months before we can introduce some breaking changes. And finally, of course, fix reported issues. So if you see some interesting bugs or find them yourself, feel free to help us fix them. Finally, let's take a look at the timeline. So we already shipped a couple of alpha versions, the last one in the end of March, but we are in this month going to ship the beta version. The changes in the beta version since the last alpha version is mainly due to file systems and members. Then we are going to ship and release candidate. We aim for around Code Garden. At that point in time, forms, deploy, and starter kit will be available. And finally, the final release, we aim for end of August. Here, Umbraco Cloud will be available and the final documentation. Of course, we are working on documentation already, but it will not be done before the final version. Thank you for listening.